There's every likelihood that by the time most people get around to hearing this sermon, and by the way, you represent a tiny fraction of those who finally will, the United States will very likely be at war. In fact, according to Debka File, which is an Israeli news service, we already are. We already have troops on the ground inside Iraq, busily doing various and sundry things preparatory to the major movements that are going to take place. And of course, in one sense of the word, we have been at war since September 11th, year 2001. But I think everyone understands what I mean when they say we will be at war. It's a very unsettling prospect. No one really likes the idea. War is always a very nasty business. And the situation, particularly at this time, is very confusing to a moral, Christian-thinking people. And you can see the evidence of that around us in the news all the time. I read somewhere, though, that the response of a normal mind in the presence of a lie is confusion. The normal response of a sane person in the presence of a lie is confusion. I'm not sure. It might have been M. Scott Peck in his book, The People of the Lie, which is an incredible read for anyone who's interested in understanding the nature of human evil. But he made that, I think it was him that made that particular point. And the same thing is true of evil. Because we are made, human beings are made to deal with information that comes to us as though it were correct. Of course, we're supposed to evaluate it, but the natural response of all of us is to take things people tell us at face value, to take, evidence at face value, to believe the things that come to us. And so consequently, when we are being lied to, we generally try to believe that it is true, and the result is confusion. And if you'd like to see a good example of this at work in world affairs, just look at what's happening in the United Nations. I've been watching world news for an awful long time, and I can never recall a time when that world body has been in the kind of confusion, and that's the only term for it, that exists up there right now. Postmodern man has a very hard time with the idea of evil. They have a hard time even believing in evil. They have a hard time believing, first of all, in the spirit world. The idea that there might be a demonic world out there somewhere is completely foreign to postmodern man. And even human evil is difficult for them because they like to think of it in terms of an illness that can be cured, as something that if we could just adjust the circumstances, it would go away. And maybe there's a cause why this man is a murderer, and we ought to be understanding of the cause behind the things that motivate him to do what he does. Postmodern man has a very difficult time with this. Ronald Reagan was ridiculed for calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. But it was. President Bush has been ridiculed for calling our enemies in this world were evildoers. But they are. And this is the thing which modern man has a lot of trouble with. Men like Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden are extremely dangerous. The younger generation today, I don't think, understand how dangerous they are. When foolish young women like the Dixie Chick somewhere off in Europe say that they're ashamed of that the President of the United States is from Texas, where they're from, you have to understand this is a generation that has no idea of evil, no real conceptualization of what it means, have never lived through anything like the older generation of this world have done, have never had to have fragments of bullets removed from their body, like at least one member of this congregation has had to have fragments removed, and carries the Purple Heart on his car to show for it. They don't know what it actually means to have to oppose evil. It takes a generation that remembers Hitler and Stalin to really understand that. And one of the things that people have difficulty with, and I had not focused on it until I read a book called Explaining Hitler, which is a really interesting read for me from this historical standpoint of trying to look at this man who is so incredibly important in history as a factor, to understand what he is, what he wasn't, why he was the way he was. And one of the things that struck me as I read through the book was that to call him insane is actually to relieve him of responsibility. And the people who really look hard at Hitler are simply not prepared to do that. They're really not prepared to say that the man was merely mad. He was not insane in some clinical sense. There were factors far deeper, far more far-reaching than that at work. Men like this are evil, and the more power they get their hands on, the more dangerous men like that are. They are like viruses in a way in the world, and they spread themselves. They're all over the place. They are unlike viruses in one sense, though. Viruses have no malice. These individuals are laden with malice. And if these men are not opposed, they will keep coming and keep coming and keep coming until they immerse us all in a cauldron of evil. They will not stop. They will not go away. They will not heal up. They will not be cured. They will just keep coming. Hitler was not opposed until it was way too late. And because he was not opposed early, some 50 million people had to die. I'm shocked. I was reading Winston Churchill's book, The History of the Second World War, this last week, and he made an interesting statement. I wasn't totally surprised, but it was shocking to me the way that came on. He said World War II was probably one of the most preventable wars in human history. It never needed to happen. And when you understand, when you go back and read the things that led up to the Second World War, and you understand the failure of good people to oppose evil from the start, from the get-go, right off the bat, their attempts to appease it, their attempts to live with it, their attempts to hope it would go away, to think that it won't come to us, all these things that went on in the world at that time made their contribution ultimately to the death of 50 million people. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the end, when Hitler no longer had any power to destroy his enemies, he was determined at the very end to destroy Germany. The orders he gave out, some of the last orders he gave to his lieutenants, were to leave a scorched earth in front of the Allies that were coming forward and to completely destroy Germany. His was a spirit given to total destruction. He would destroy and use the German war machine as an instrument of destruction of other peoples. And when he could no longer destroy other peoples, he would use it to destroy Germany and then itself. And of course, he finally did the ultimate act of destruction. He killed himself. He killed himself. He destroyed everything right back down to himself, and then he destroyed that. Now, what is often not realized by people who never come into contact with these people is that they are highly charismatic individuals. I've never been around somebody quite like that, but when you're around a charismatic person, you can feel it when you're with them. And there are far more people like this than you can possibly imagine. People with this kind of an evil charisma who have the power to dominate, the power to lead, the power to almost hypnotize suggestible people. There are more of these people around than you can ever imagine. Mercifully, not many of them ever acquire the kind of power that Saddam Hussein has, or that Hitler had, or that Osama bin Laden has, because he had money, and that's power. But they are all after power. Something inside of them, and maybe that says more than you might think, something inside of them demands that they acquire power over others. And this is a phenomenon that shows up in varying degrees among human beings. I remember Rollo May in his book, Love and Will, made this statement. It's the only thing I remember out of his book. He said that when men lose the power to love, they usually substitute power over. But in this particular case, I think there is something far more than merely having lost the power to love. There is an almost demonic desire for, striving for, power over. I think that's what the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart was all about. Brian Mitchell, the character who in Blasphemy calls himself Emmanuel, was in the early stages of power acquisition. And it was really only alert citizens and a little girl who remembered what he looked like who were able to pull this thing together and save that little girl's life. Otherwise, that man would have gone right on down the road and would have found himself another and another and another teenage girl to be his wife. I don't know if you've read this part of it yet or not, but it was suggested that he had the idea that it was far better for him to have younger women because, as his mate, whatever she was, said, older women would be less likely to submit to his authority. Therefore, it was better that he have young girls, in this case 15. And if you haven't heard this, there's evidence that he had actually gone to her first cousin's home, her very best friend's home, and to put a chair outside the window and cut the screen and somehow couldn't get in and left. But he was after another girl, her very closest friend, just a few days after he had kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. Just out there. Now, an interesting thing about that, if he'd gotten her, they might have gotten him quicker, because that MO, the motive operandi, would have told the police something that they didn't know until this week when they finally captured the man. But he was on his way. He was intending to become a cult leader, and he would have become one of those really bizarre, dangerous cult leaders if he had not somewhere along the had on this particular occasion been caught. He'd written a 27-page manifesto last year about taking multiple wives. And authorities say he may have taken Elizabeth for that reason and then tried to kidnap her cousin as well. A mental health worker who spoke to Mitchell's wife, Wanda Barzee in jail, said Saturday that Barzee told her Mitchell had a revelation instructing him to take 7 wives. You know, where'd this thing come from? You know, I have to tell you the truth. I don't necessarily think people like Mitchell make this up. I don't think he's sitting there and said, well, let's see. I'd like to have 7 women. I'll just invent the idea I have a revelation, and I'll just tell people that, and I'll go on down the road. I don't think so. I think there's more to this going on, and in the insanity, if you wish to call it that, of a man like that. But there is something profound happening when a person starts off down this road. We have glimpsed right here the beginning of something that could have turned out like David Koresh in Waco in time to come. In an interview on, this is the point. In an interview Sunday, this is a quotation from the news, she said Barzee told her that on Thanksgiving Day, the couple received a revelation that Mitchell was to have 7 wives. Barzee spoke about the need to take younger wives because older women would not be submissive enough to marry him. And if you've seen his picture in the paper, you ladies all know exactly what that means. The thing that struck me about this, and we are yet to find out what the story will be, and I think I wish the news media would lay off the family until we have the real story, until it finally comes out. But the thing that strikes me about what I've heard so far is something that matches something I already know about these people. They are like snakes in that they hypnotize their prey until they have consumed them finally. And this is the whole thing. They'll say about a snake, it can kind of hypnotize the animal that it's ready to take. And I think these men have a hypnotic power about them that have the ability to really control and to lord over suggestible people and to lead them in places where no person really ought to ever go. We'll find out what the whole story is on this one. One thing to watch for as the investigation and trial of Mitchell and Barzee proceeds is how much confusion they are able to generate. And don't forget what I told you about the response of a normal human mind in the presence of a lie is confusion. And you are going to find this whole trial, the whole process of this, to be an incredibly confusing experience, because this man has already said he wants to conduct his own defense in court. And you can only imagine, you really can't imagine yet what kind of a circus that will be if he is able to make that stick and is able to be his own counsel in court. It will be a circus of the likes of which nobody, I think, has seen yet in court in this country. If I were the judge, I think I'd see if I couldn't find me a psychiatrist that declared him insane, lock him up somewhere for the rest of his life and forget about him. For at least if there is a demon there, it will be with him wherever he is for the rest of his life. Now, what is the difference between a Brian Mitchell and Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein? You know, there is a difference between them. What's the difference between Brian Mitchell and Osama bin Laden? Money. What's the difference between Brian Mitchell and Saddam Hussein? Power. Otherwise, you're looking at the same sort of mind, you're looking at the same kind of evil, the desire to dominate, the desire to control, and it is all about self. All about themselves, all about them, all about their control and their power. Now, the frightening thing about this is that there are probably thousands of people out there running around with this same spirit. Right now, as we speak. It has manifested itself in their lives in varying degrees. Some of them are locked up in prison somewhere for something or other they did. Some of them are still loose. Brian Mitchell is now locked up in jail, and he will be there now, I think, for a very long time. And so on it goes. But these people are all over the place. Lenny Cascio was telling us on the forum this last month, his Trucker's Bible Study up near Kansas City this last week, that a man came through there very similar to the character of a Brian Mitchell in this regard. Brian Mitchell had sold everything he had, cleared out all of his possessions, and became homeless deliberately so that he could become a preacher to the homeless people. And he's an itinerant preacher wandering around the country speaking to people. Lenny said a guy came to his trucker's Bible study this week just like that, who had sold everything he had, went on the road to become an itinerant preacher to homeless people. And he also said that the man was very charismatic. And I knew exactly what he was talking about when he said that, because I have met these people on any number of occasions. And I personally, I'm not frightened of them, but I find them frightening personalities and frightening people. And the difference, again, is they don't have the weapons to kill anybody, don't have the weapons or the control to destroy lives in their thousands. Now, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't if they could get it. I don't think that this is what we normally think of as demon possession or madness. And this is an interesting distinction that has to be drawn, and I'm not qualified to draw it. I know that M. Scott Peck, in his book, The People of the Lie, characterized people like this as people of the lie, and he characterized what they carry with them as a form of human evil. And he drew a distinction between demon possession, which he claims to have actually seen, witnessed, been involved in exorcisms, and knows what the devil, is like in that regard. And he draws a distinction between this type of evil and that type of evil, and maybe the distinction is there to be drawn. On the other hand, it might also be a distinction more of degree than of kind, but I can't answer that question. I don't know enough to do it. But I will say this, that what we're talking about here transcends what we normally think of as demon possession, and I think is probably far more dangerous to the people who encounter it than demon possession. Because a demon-possessed man who cuts himself and cries and wails in the tomb at night and throws himself into the fire is a danger primarily to himself. These people are a serious danger to everyone they come into contact with. Everyone. And there's a distinct difference here. Now, I will say this. There are people who are not confused in the presence of the lie or of evil. There are people. I'm not going to say that they're abnormal, but maybe in one sense of the word, they are special. But there are people who, when they come into the presence of a lie, are not confused. The reason they are not is because they know it and they brand it from the outset as a lie. The people who are not confused by evil are people who are willing to recognize it as such and call it what it is, evil. And that's why when President, Bush sees all this stuff coming down, he doesn't analyze it. He doesn't go into any great depth. No psychoanalysis. He says, evildoers. And so he clearly sees what he's dealing with. He is not confused. He knows precisely what he wants to do. Has no question. His only problem is all of postmodern man out there who look at this situation and are confused by it and don't realize what's coming down on them. Winston Churchill was a man who clearly saw the evil of Hitler, said so early on, called it what it was. And as a result of that, because he kept calling it what it was, for a period of time, he was dismissed and cleaned out of power, and nobody could stand him. All his friends were more loyal to him, and even his enemies respected him, but they wouldn't let him in any kind of power until finally they all saw the evil that he had been telling them was there all along. But before they saw it, countless thousands of people had to die. And because they didn't see it, millions more would die. Hitler could have been opposed very early, and the whole problem ended. It's really simple. And killing these people, by and large, is not necessarily the way to go, but they do absolutely need to be disarmed and locked up where they can't get at anybody else. I believe the death penalty is appropriate. But in some case, I know this may sound strange to you, but I think in some cases, people like Hitler, like Saddam Hussein, like Osama bin Laden, the evil that these men carry, if it is spiritual, if it does come if it is otherworldly, we'd probably be smarter to lock them up somewhere and throw away the key than we would to kill them. And in the process of killing them, you release the spirit that's in them. You haven't accomplished very much in the battle against evil. The only advantage you might have is that the spirit might wind up in some idiot like Brian Mitchell. But that is another story. These men, as I said, are willing to do it. While Hitler was hypnotizing Europe and devouring it, Churchill recognized him at every stage for what he was, called him what he was, didn't equivocate, made no excuses, and you all know the story of that. Now, all this runs counter to the mindset that today people are prone to carelessly call liberal. I think it is fair to say that there are some people who believe that evil can be cured. Don't you think that's probably true? There are people out there today, if you read their columns, read what they're saying, read what they have to say about it, they believe that evil can be cured. These are the people who are confused in the presence of evil because they don't really believe that it exists. There are other people who believe that evil can only be destroyed. I suspect that they are wrong too. Evil can be disarmed, evil can be contained, evil can be resisted, but it probably can't be destroyed because in the end I think we are going to find that it is spiritual. So how can we avoid being confused in the presence of evil? Well, as an exercise in understanding evil, how should we think about this war? Because this war is about good and evil. The first thing we have to do is to give up the God of our imagination and come face to face with the real God of the real Bible. Because he does not match what most people carry around in their hearts and minds as their imagination of a grandfather in the sky who will put up with almost anything. The second thing we have to come to understand, and this is crucial in understanding what we're doing here, we have to clearly understand that there is a difference between the Christian's responsibility as a private person and the responsibility of those people who are in government. The biblical admonitions to us as private parties, private citizens, individuals, to turn the other cheek, to return, don't give back evil for evil, to be careful not to seek private vengeance, and all those warnings are to us as private parties. They are not instructions to government as to how to conduct their affairs in a dangerous world out there. Private citizens must not pursue vengeance. Governments must pursue vengeance on the part of private citizens. You understand the distinction between those two things? The reason I'm trying to make this point, I got a letter just this last week being taken to task for what I said in the latest Living to Win. That I made the point that this is a war that probably must be fought. And they thought, well, how can you say something like that when the Bible says love your enemies? The Bible says that as a private party, I have to love my enemies. Governments can't love anyone. Governments don't love. Governments don't hate. Governments are supposed to be impartial, and they are supposed to protect the rights of the weak, the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed, so that the weak, the poor, the downtrodden, and the oppressed don't revolt and wind up taking the law into their own hands, creating chaos and revolution and more destruction than we ever would have. A government that will not defend the weak invites anarchy, and that's one of the great dangers of the world. This so-called world government we got out here right now that really do not seem at this point in time to know how to come in out of the rain. One of the most dramatic examples of what I'm talking about governments pursuing vengeance on the part of people and this whole idea, is the perpetual war that God said would exist between him and one race of people on this planet. Did you know that there was such a war declared by God years ago, and that it was to be a perpetual war? That through all generations, whatever in time, there is war between these people and God. It's found in Exodus, the 17th chapter. I'm going to begin reading in verse 8. Exodus 17, verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, get us some men and let's go out and fight Amalek. Tomorrow I'll stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him, and he fought with Amalek. Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. It came to pass when Moses held up his hands, Israel was winning. He let down his hands, Amalek prevailed. I dare say you have probably at some time in your life heard a sermon based on this principle. That as long as Moses had his hands up, Israel was winning. He got tired and put them down, the battle turned and went the other way. There's some profound lessons probably involved in this. Most people that I've heard preach on this developed those lessons and never bothered to go on to the end of the story. Moses' hands were heavy. They took a stone, he sat on it, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, one on one side, the other side, and his hands were steady till the going down of the sun. He probably had no blood left in him. He was probably a very tired old man at this time. But Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people and put his people to the edge of the sword. And the Lord said to Moses, write this down for a memorial in a book. I want you to rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Now, this is almost funny in a way, because it's like a contradiction in terms. He says, write it down in a book for a memorial. I'm going to blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. But the fact is that memorial would always be there, so we're never going to really forget about Amalek. You have a little internal contradiction, but it's merely a figure of speech. But what God is saying, this is what I'm going to do. Anyway, he says, Moses built an altar, and he called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, for he said, quote, because the Lord has sworn that Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, let's just, understand what we're talking about here. Not just anybody can declare war. Not just anybody should be out there fighting his enemies. Not just anybody should be taking vengeance on evildoers. That's not the role of us as private parties. But at the same time, it is conceivable that a war can be declared by God against a people, and that war fought by human beings designated by God to carry that war out. Hey, it did. You're looking at it. It's right there on the page. And as I said, I don't want to give anybody the impression, that the God of your imagination who says, oh, no, God would never do anything like that. You better get used to the idea. Yes, he would. It sits right here on the page. And people can make all the arguments they want about New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, and so on and so forth. Covenants change. Testaments change. God doesn't. And consequently, the God you're dealing with here is the God who right now is looking down on Iraq, Iran, the United States, Great Britain, Spain, France, and evaluating and weighing in the balances what people are doing. Same God who just said this about Amalek. Now, make no mistake, the instrument of God's war with Amalek was to be Israel. He wasn't going to fight against them with lightning, thunderstorms, earthquakes, nothing of that nature. He wanted Israel to get the job done. You'll find this in Deuteronomy 25. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. I want you to remember what Amalek did to you by the way when you come forth out of the land of Egypt, how he met you by the way, and he smote the hindmost of you, even all that were feeble behind you when you were faint and weary, and he wasn't afraid of God. You realize what he's talking about? Here is Israel, strung out across the wilderness in great line of march. And you know what happens. The old people, the infirm, the people who are not very well, the people who had trouble keeping up, all these stragglers slowly will drift back to the back of the line of march, won't they? And guess where these cowards from Amalek decided to strike? They didn't go to the front of the line where the men of war were. They didn't go up there and thump their chest and says, come on out here and bring your swords and let's have a good fight. No. These cowards smote the weak, the feeble, the innocent, all those people who were weak and unable to follow. And God says, I will never forget that. I will never forget that till the sun, as long as the sun is going up and the sun is going down. He says, therefore it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies round about in the land, which the Lord has given you for an inheritance to possess it, you shall blot out the remembrance from Amalek under heaven. You shall not forget it. Look at that phrase. Blot out the remembrance, but don't forget it. It's, as I said, it's almost contradictory, but it's a figure of speech. He wanted all the records of them. He wanted all their memorials. He wanted any statue the Amalekites had put up. All that stuff was to be gone. And the Amalekites themselves had jolly well better be gone. They had a choice of either leaving the whole part of the country and migrating off into wherever, or dying where they stood on their feet, because that's what God wanted for these people. Now, what kind of people does God get after in that way? Well, I'll tell you for sure it's not people like us. It's not people who care about their children, their grandchildren. It's not the kind of people, if they saw a lost child wandering around the street, would pick the child up, take him down to the police station, try to find mom and dad, buy an ice cream cone, try to keep the kid from crying, and so forth. It's not our kind of people who do this. What kind of people are these? What kind of evil had so permeated their society? What were they practicing in the privacy of their homes or in the public in their streets? What were these people doing? Well, we know already what kind of a violent people they were. We know that they were cowardly. We know they were cutting up women and children. We know they were killing old people at the back of the column. We know all this stuff about Amalek. So we have to understand that when God comes down and pronounces judgment on a people like this, he's got good reason for doing so. Which means There are people in this world who are bad enough to get that kind of judgment from God. Regardless of what some people may think about, well, no, people aren't that bad, and there's no such thing as a bad boy. I'm sorry. Yes, there is. There are such thing as bad people. They are bad to the bone, bad to the core, and the best thing that could happen to them is to kill them. Now, I know that doesn't sound very good coming from a Christian, does it? Well, I'm not speaking at this point as what one should do as an individual Christian. I'm speaking of what one should do if one is responsible for the safety of a nation of people. I'm talking about what a commander-in-chief must do. I'm talking about what the jurists must do. I'm talking about what the judges have to do. I'm talking about what the juries have to do. Because if the people who are in those levels of authority do not protect the weak, nobody's going to protect the weak, and evil will prevail in any society, locally and in the world at large. Unless evil is opposed actively, evil will prevail. But didn't Jesus say, love evil, love your enemies and return good for evil and overcome evil with good? Sure. At the individual, personal level, yes. But if you think that evil in the world is going to go away, if you think we can go over there and send a bunch of roses to Saddam Hussein and make him feel better about us as a people, and he's no longer going to want to do bad things over here or support our enemies against us, you're dreaming. The only way some of these things can be dealt with is the way God dealt with them in the past and may well deal with them again in the future. For who is the sword in God's hand to avenge the 3,000 people who died in the Twin Towers on 9/11? For God will avenge them. Make no mistake about that. Now, there's another question that keeps popping up around in different quarters these days. Is preemptive war wrong? Is it actually wrong to move before your enemy moves? Interesting question. Well, let's take a look at an idea. Psalm 21, verse 7. Psalm 21, verse 7. He says, for the king trusts in the Lord, and through the mercy of the Most High he will not be moved. Your hand shall find out all your enemies, and your right hand shall find out those who hate you. You shall make them like a fiery oven in the time of your anger. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath. The fire will devour them. Their fruit shall you destroy from the earth, their seed from among the children of men. Tough stuff, isn't it? It's a complete wipeout he's talking about here. And then listen to what he says. For they intended evil against you. They imagined a mischievous device which they are not able to perform. Why were they not able to perform it? Because they'd been killed. Because of what went before. God swallowed them up in his wrath. He came down on them. Why did he do this? Because they intended to do evil. Not because they had done evil. So we even find the doctrine of preemption in the Bible. Well, yeah, of course, God is the one who can preempt anything he wants to. But you've got to bear in mind that in the Bible, the sword in God's hand is often a nation. It's a king. It's a man who rules, a man who may rule justly, a man who may rule fairly. In some cases, it's somebody who doesn't rule very well at all. It's just that the time has come, and God reaches down, taps some individual, and says, go get them. And as a result of it, people die. People died in their hundreds. People died in their thousands. Sometimes you got to fight. There was a big argument. Jimmy Carter, I know, had an article in the New York Times recently about the fact that the American criteria in this particular case in Iraq did not meet what he had seen over the years to be the idea of a just war. There were 5 different characteristics he had that were required for a just war. I looked at those, I thought about them a great deal, and I began to realize that all these concepts, the just war concept, is something that arose well over 1,000 years ago in a totally different world and totally different circumstances where different wars were fought for different reasons and so forth. And the question then is, well, is it just for us to fight this particular war and basically to go to war for these reasons? And I began to realize as I did that there is no such thing as a just war. It's a contradiction in terms, really. There are wars that are necessary and there are wars that are unnecessary. And a lot of times you do not know which is which until afterward. You've got to do what you've got to do. And history will judge whether what you have done is right or whether it's wrong. And if you're a godly person, you're going to have to go to your knees and say, God, I know you're going to judge me for what I'm about to do. But I'm going to do it because I believe that it is the right thing to do. Now, I have no idea what kind of a relationship George Bush has with the Almighty. I hear he prays every day on his knees. I hear he reads his Bible every day on his knees. What I hear about him leads me to believe that there is no way that George W. Bush would take up the sword on behalf of this nation without first going to God in prayer and telling God what he's about to do and asking for God's guidance, God's blessing, and for what must be done. I think he does. I think he does. And he may be wrong. History will tell whether he is wrong or not. But at the same time, then, looking at the Bible, preemptive war is not wrong. You can act on a nation's intentions if you can discern what those intentions are. And the thing that's sobering to me through all of this is that the Defense Department, the State Department, the CIA, and the White House are all profoundly persuaded that they know what Saddam Hussein's intentions are. We already know what Osama bin Laden's intentions are, so we have no problem there. They're persuaded they know what Saddam Hussein's intentions are. And of course, many people forget, actually this is the phase 2 of a war that began a very long time ago. The eradication of evil was a prime focus of Israel when they came into the land. There was plenty of it there. It needed to be actively opposed. It had to be dealt with. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, I'm going to begin reading in verse 29. There's a very powerful statement made in this regard. He said, when the Lord your God shall cut off the nations from before you where you go to possess them, and you succeed them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following after them, after they have been destroyed before you, and that you don't inquire after their gods, saying, well, now let's see, how did those nations serve their gods? I'll do that. I'll adapt their customs, and maybe they'll be more comfortable with us living here, and we'll worship God together. You shall not do so to the Lord your God. Every abomination to the Lord which he hates have they done to their gods, for even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. Now look, what kind of people are we talking about here? We're talking about the kind of people who take a little bitty baby down to a pagan idol, kill the child, and burn it in the fire as a burnt offering to an idol. At least I hope they killed it before they burned it. Well, everything I command you, God says, you observe to do that. Don't add anything to it. Don't take anything away from it. The world you're living in has got some stuff going on, and I don't want you to have any part in it. You are to obliterate, to oppose evil. And then in chapter 13 he says this, and this is a very sobering passage. If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass whereof he spoke, says, and then he says, give you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass. And he says, let's go after other gods you have not known, and let's serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to see where your heart is. Now that is really spooky. Because the whole question is whether or not you're going to remain faithful to the Word of God, or whether you're going to follow some idiot that can pull off a magic trick for you. That's the question. Are you going to be true to the Word of God, or are you going to follow some idiot that has some persuasive argument of some kind? Are you going to stay faithful? He said the Lord your God is going to let that happen to see whether you're willing to follow him with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. You walk after the Lord your God. You fear him. You keep his commandments. You obey his voice. You serve him. You cleave to him. And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has spoken to take you away from God. Look at verse 6. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is like your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let's go and serve other gods whom you have not known, nor your fathers. I don't care how close this person is to you. You shall not consent to him, verse 8. You shall not hearken to him either. Neither shall your eye pity him, neither shall you spare. You will not cover up for him. You shall surely kill him. Now, you don't just kill him on the spot. You kill him judiciously, because it says your hand shall first be upon him, and afterward the hand of all the people. Your mother, son, daughter, brother, friend who is closer than a brother, if they begin to introduce this evil into the land, you don't cover up for him. You become, in God's eyes, an accessory if you do. This is pretty stern stuff. What he's saying simply is, you can't play patty cakes with evil. You've got to kill it. And it's in the light of the Scripture, I think you can understand what Jesus said. Remember what he said in Luke 14? He says, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and his own life also, he can't be my disciple. You need to make a little mark in your Bible to connect this to the one I just read back in Deuteronomy, because that's what he's talking about. He is talking about you cannot allow any one of those people, I don't care how close they are to you, to take you away from God. But didn't Jesus say we should turn the other cheek? That we should not avenge ourselves. And he certainly did. But as I've already said, that's his instruction to individuals, not his instructions to governments. Paul, writing to the Roman church about legitimate governmental power, Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the higher power, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. I want you to ask one quick question. Who in Paul's day, when he sat down and wrote this letter, were the powers that be for the people who got the letter? Rome. The Roman Empire. He says, whoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. You don't fight against constituted civil authority, folks. That's what he's saying. They that do so shall receive to themselves judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Will you not then be afraid of the power? You do what's good. They'll think a lot. They'll speak well of you. For he is the minister of God to you for good. Good grief. Rome. And in fact, the Roman civil government was constituted. God did let them and granted to them as human authority the power to keep the world safe. And when Rome was in power, you could travel the highways. You could, without fear of bandits. You could engage in commerce. Rome didn't care. You could buy and sell. You could go here, come there. Rome, they had what they called a Pax Romana. That is the peace of Rome. Fight Rome, and you were in a whole peck of trouble. Go along, just keep the civil laws, and you'll be just fine. For the most part. There were some exceptions, but Paul is talking about generalities. He said, if you do what's evil, you be afraid. And then he says this, for he bears not the sword in vain. The civil government legitimately bears the sword. The sword is a symbol of war, of military power, of the power of life and death. And I derive from this a principle I want to tell you right now. And I'll tell it to you twice because I want to be sure we all understand it. It is wrong for Christians to undermine the legitimate authority of government to execute wrath upon evildoers. Complicated sentence. I couldn't find a simpler way of saying it. It's wrong for Christians to undermine the legitimate authority of government to execute wrath on evildoers. We shouldn't be doing that. We can send flowers to a murderer. We can send him a box of candy in prison. We can do right to him and encourage him to turn his heart to God and turn away from God. We can be generous and kind and forgiving and all of that, but I do not expect the governor of the state to be. I expect the governor of the state to follow the laws of the state and to execute the murderous killer of innocent people. It's what the law calls for. God's law calls for it. God expects it to be done of him because God can kill and God can make alive. And of course, if we do this, then it makes possible what Paul said just before he said this. And this is what many people who cite this scripture I'm about to read to you don't realize, that this leads into what I just read to you about the power of the civil government. He says in Romans 12:19, Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but give place to wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. How does God do that? He does it through the civil government. That's how. The powers that be. Therefore, if your enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing you shall heap coals of fire on his head. Don't be overcome of evil. Overcome evil with good. And that's what you and I have got to do unless we happen to be the governor of the state of Texas. In which case, in our private life, we must follow it as this. In our public official life, we must execute vengeance on behalf of all who are oppressed. If we don't do so, I think it's possible that God would hold us accountable for the innocent blood in our land. If you were in a position of a judge in ancient Israel and you neglected to avenge the blood of the innocent, what would God expect of you? What's his attitude be toward you? Deuteronomy 19, verse 11. Deuteronomy 19, verse 11. If any man hate his neighbor and lie in wait for him and rise up against him and smite him mortally that he die, and he flees to a city of refuge, then the elders of his city shall send and fetch him from there and deliver him into the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die. Listen to what he says. Your eye will not pity him. Why? Why is it that we can't do that? He says, you have to put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel that it might go well with you. That if you don't execute judgment, the blood of the innocent is not expunged from your land, and the whole land then becomes guilty before God. People who are in authority have a terrible, terrible responsibility to be diligent in carrying out that type of thing. Keep in mind that God's sword is often the sword in the hands of men. You can listen to this short verse out of the song that God gave to Moses. Give ear, O you heavens, and I will speak. O hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. My doctrine shall drop as the rain. My speech shall distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and the shower upon the grass. Because I will publish the name of the Lord. Ascribe ye greatness to our God. He is the rock. His word is perfect. All his ways are judgment, a God of truth and without iniquity. Just and right is he. Verse 39. See now, I'm he. There is no God that is with me. I kill, I make alive. I wound, I heal. Neither is there any who can deliver out of my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and say, I live forever. If I whet my glittering sword, and my hand take hold of judgment, I will render vengeance to my enemies, and I will reward those that hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh, and that with the blood of the slain and of captives, from the beginning of the revenges upon the enemy. Rejoice, rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants, and will render vengeance to his adversaries, and will be merciful to his land and to his people. So, how do we think about this sort of thing that's about to come upon us? Well, I think we have an obligation not to undermine, as I said, the President of the United States in carrying out his just responsibility to avenge this country of our enemies, because that's one thing that God authorizes the leaders of nations to do. And it does appear that Saddam Hussein has become an enemy not only of the United States of America, but by his actions and the way he treats people, he is also an enemy of God. And it may well be we're about to see God's vengeance visited upon him. And the words that I keep hearing rolling back to me out of the Bible are, your eye shall not pity him.